for multilateral rules for countries to formulate their own environmental policies and to respond to complaints about the impact of their own policies on international competitiveness. This report predated the Rio Earth Summit by several months, but it illustrates that several different forces were all beginning to consider how to regulate trade so that industry can prosper without threatening extinction to species or the biosphere in which we all live. When the Rio Earth Summit was held in June of 1992, ISO 14000 got a tremendous boost. The Earth Summit and its progeny, Agenda 21, is still having an enormous impact around the world. Many initiatives were brought forward to the different nations that attended, together with hundreds of NGOs from all parts of the globe. The Convention on Biodiversity, the development of an Earth Ethics Charter, and amendments to existing treaties and conventions, such as the Montreal Protocol, were all discussed at length. If there is a phrase that best embodies the concepts that were driving those who attended the Earth Summit, it is, no doubt, sustainable development. Implicit in this notion is the concept that trade or development, material wealth from the economy, is a goal throughout the world, desired both by the developed and the developing nations. We now recognize that such economic development cannot long be maintained if it is not sustainable, or linked to an appreciation of the fact that resources should not be depleted and pollution should not be created faster than the natural processes can replace the resources or neutralize the pollution. Accepting this fundamental premise represented a stunning agreement between business leaders and environmental advocates who had for the last 30 years viewed each other as the enemy. Instead of polar antagonists, we now had a consensual agreement that both business and the environment had to survive. So policies were needed so the two goals could be harmonized. And this thought is captured in the notion of sustainable development. This simple phrase holds much power in its recognition of the inevitability of economic development and the necessity that such development be sustainable. Out of this concept, ISO 14000 found fertile soil in which to grow as an idea. The elegance of the process that brought us ISO 14000 is that it avoided the need for multilateral discussions among the countries and avoided the need for politicians to adopt rules, let alone try and harmonize those rules with other countries, to balance the interests of trade and the environment. This was a political achievement of note, but when you think about it, there were no politics involved at all. In fact, the absence of politics and the closed procedures used by the organization that adopted these rules leads to some of the concerns that we later address as challenges. It is the source of the skepticism on the part of many in the environmental community. ISO sidestepped the ordinary process of developing international standards or agreements on environmental matters. It leaves to each individual organization, and not government, the most significant decisions about environmental performance, and optimistically requests that government, industry, and service, any productive entity, review their own operations with a goal towards obtaining ever better results with ever better procedures. Now, proponents of ISO 14000 urge that this is appropriate, and that enlightened self-interest will lead to acceptance of demanding product or service performance standards similar to the concepts behind total quality management. That concept, which has been the subject of a different presentation in this series, is based on the notion that industrial and manufacturing processes should be oriented towards pleasing the customer, and that constant review and adjustment of those processes is necessary to continue to meet changing needs of customers. ISO 14000, among other things, suggests a plan for adopting this sort of TQM for the environment, and that it sets in place a system or a conformance standard by which a company or organization can continually monitor environmental indicators to assure itself that it is continuously improving in its own procedures. But more importantly, an underlying promise of ISO 14000 is that it moves toward a principle long discussed in the international trade community. In 1972, the OECD published a set of guiding principles concerning the international economic aspects of environmental policies. Among those principles was one called the harmonization principle. The notion here was that governments should seek to harmonize environmental policies unless valid reasons for differences exist. As earlier described, ISO 14000 offers the basis for one kind of harmonization. By creating a uniform set of procedures that can be adopted by companies or organizations anywhere, ISO 14000 may be the precursor of a de facto worldwide uniform standard for environmental management systems. It will at least provide consistent terms that will be understood from one country to the next and from one industry to the next. It should evolve into consistent auditing methodologies. Lastly, it ought to embody a consistent philosophy of sustainable development, even though the phrase is found only once in the preamble and was frankly negotiated out of much of the final standard. Still, these are the beginnings of a global acceptance of powerful concepts. And in this, there is reason to be hopeful. Not all the benefits of ISO 14000 are environmental in nature. As I elaborated on during last year's presentation, there is a balance between economic opportunity and the environment that we try to achieve, or should try to achieve, in all business activities. ISO 14000 provides economic opportunity as well as hope for environmental benefits. In fact, it is likely that the economic opportunity, more than the environmental benefits, will lead to the acceptance of this program in many places. This economic opportunity flows from the fact that ISO 14000 is expected to, eventually, create access to markets. It is generally thought that the ISO 14000 will be readily adopted throughout the European Union, and that EU customers, whether they be government procurement customers, distributors, or retail customers, will eventually require ISO 14000 certification as a matter of course. This expectation is derived primarily from the way that ISO 9000, the set of regulations addressing product quality standards, has grown to be accepted throughout the world. If ISO 14000 standards grow the same way, as most commentators believe they will become a de facto requirement for access to important markets for products. Like ISO 9000, there will likely be a ripple effect, with companies that need to be 14000 certified for their customers demanding that their own suppliers also achieve certified status. ISO 14000 should create access to markets, but we have to be careful that the access is equal for all players. And there are reasons to fear, as we'll discuss later, that this is not the case in the developing nations. Another economic incentive for ISO 14000 is that it will also allow the manufacturer to position products for a competitive advantage. Many consumers are attracted to products that can advertise themselves as being green or environmentally friendly. ISO 14000 led to the adoption of labeling standards so that people have an assurance that products advertising themselves as environmentally friendly meet the standards that are required by the ISO. ISO 14000 will lend a credibility to those labels that is expected to attract consumers and thereby position companies who want to be seen as good corporate citizens or leaders in environmental protection. Use of the label may gain widespread acceptance, such that their products will be positioned to sell better. ISO 14000 can therefore become another way to distinguish one's products from those of the competition and secure an economic advantage in the marketplace. Yet there is danger in this aspect of the ISO process as well, because the ISO label may not be indicative of an environmentally friendly company. and different labeling programs adopted by individual countries may be challengeable as non-tariff barriers to trade under the GATT. These, then, are some of the issues that reflect the promise and challenge of ISO 14000. The voluntary commitment that companies enter into to adopt an environmental management system and improve their environmental procedures over time is a promise. But the challenge is to ensure that corporate policies don't just look for an easy way out. The harmonization of environmental standards, terms, definitions, and procedures is a promise. But the challenge is to ensure that these systems are used to achieve sustainable development. Access to markets that are a competitive advantage for products in that marketplace is a promise. But the challenge is to ensure that access doesn't unfairly exclude the developing nations from participating in the benefits. Recognizing that there are distinct possible benefits to the ISO process, let us still review just a few of the reasons behind those concerns I've identified, particularly from a legal frame of reference. First, why do I have a specific concern related to the use of ISO 14000 in the developing countries? Well, it stems from my worry about the unique nature of the ISO decision-making process. I earlier called it elegant because it sidestepped politics and the sometimes frustrating process that multilateral agreements are forced to travel. The ISO process is a relatively closed one. It is limited to members of the ISO, which includes sometimes obscure standard-setting agencies, which may be part of government, or quasi-governmental, or wholly private organizations. The activities of these agencies are not historically followed by the NGOs and the media with an interest in environmental protection. In addition, many of the nations in the developing world simply did not participate actively while these technical bodies were considering early drafts of ISO 14000. This graph illustrates that of the 141 developing nations that are members of the United Nations, only 50 are members of ISO, and only about half of those participated in the discussions of Technical Committee 207, the committee of ISO members charged with developing the draft documents. This information was compiled by an environmental consulting firm called Benchmark at the request of the United Nations, and the report it came out of has some very interesting analyses that you can review by requesting a copy directly. To get a copy, write Benchmark via their email address, benchmarkinteramp.com. As the earlier graphic showed, only a handful of developing nations actually participated in the negotiations leading up to the standard, and only 22 were present to vote when it actually passed. Part of the reason for the limited involvement of developing countries is the ISO process itself. It is somewhat arcane, with a committee structure, mechanisms for reviewing and incorporating comments, and a methodology that can determine the allowable scope of a technical committee's work very early in the process. In this case, those early decisions explicitly removed the technical committee's consideration of limit values for environmental pollutants and environmental performance values generally. These may have been of great interest to developing nations who might not want to be environmental dumping grounds for practices that are unacceptable elsewhere, but the ISO process prevented the issues from being addressed. Issues such as technology transfer or a phase-in period for implementation might have been valuable to the developing countries, but the ISO process excluded these issues. Seeing as critical decisions were being made in the very early stages, participation at that time would have been critical, but it didn't occur. Maybe part of the reason developing countries didn't participate was the high cost of having a team attend all meetings and devote themselves to the negotiation of draft standards. Maybe it was the fact that the ISO documents and discussions are all in English. French drafts of documents are eventually produced, but often not until the last minute. Other translations simply don't happen through the ISO offices. Worse yet, the English used is not always the clearest. As is often true with technical language, some of the draft standards are rugged going for people to whom English is not their first language. Nuance is often critical. I understand that considerable debate occurred on changing the original proposed language referring to environmental impacts to the use of the term environmental aspects. For developing countries, ISO represents a new opportunity to access world markets, but ISO 14000 does not represent a new mandatory approach to environmental protection. As some commentators have noted, for the ISO 14000 to have resulted in a process standard, or what we call a conformance standard, how to do things the way everyone else is doing them, there was relatively little attention paid to the ISO process itself. The lesson for the future is that developing nations must participate in these negotiations to protect their own interests. If necessary, hire the lawyers and consultants to get critical advice on how and when to steer this process. Too much is at stake to sit at the sidelines. It occurs to me that before I risk sounding too cautious or pessimistic, that I should remind the audience that I do think ISO 14000 provides an opportunity that is full of promise. To take advantage of this promise, companies and countries must understand the scope of ISO 14000 and adopt regulations and laws that will encourage the use of this tool to the best possible effect with regard to environmental protection. This is more true when ISO 14000 is considered in the global context. It is, after all, the hope of developing an international standard that makes ISO 14000 so exciting. The idea that firms everywhere will have similar baseline processes gives us a common language for achievement. However, the process alone does not guarantee any achievement at all. Like the ISO 9000 standards, it is often said that a company which makes cement life jackets could have them certified under the ISO 9000 if it had appropriate quality control procedures in place. The fact that the life jackets would instantly drown whoever wore them would be of no consequence. Still, ISO 9000 is widely recognized as creating a common language for quality standards throughout the world. The same is true of ISO 14000. The adoption of ISO 14000 will not result necessarily in the deserved levels of environmental protection. And it will even be possible for companies who are poor environmentalists to be ISO 14000 certified if they follow the laws and regulations of the country in which they operate. Unfortunately, this may not tell the world very much because those laws may not require much in the way of environmental protection. ISO 14000 is not an international standard in the sense that it demands environmental performance from those companies who are certified under it. The only direct link between environmental performance and the ISO 14000 standards are that organizations and companies that are certified under ISO 14001 must commit to continual improvement of their environmental activities, or, as we've said in the ISO 14000 language, aspects. In addition, companies and organizations have to commit to comply with relevant law and regulation and their own voluntary policies that they adopt under ISO 14000. Unlike the general trend of international agreements or other voluntary programs that corporate leaders have adopted over the years, such as the CERES program, which stands for Coalition for Environmentally Responsible Economies, ISO 14000 does not establish specific mandates. While ISO requires a commitment to comply with existing environmental laws and regulations, it says nothing about complying with existing environmental standards that may have been negotiated through the multilateral agreements. The Montreal Protocol, which requires reductions in the use of chlorofluorocarbons, is an important agreement by many nations seeking to halt the depletion of the ozone layer in the Earth's atmosphere. The Basel Convention is an important agreement that many nations entered into restricting the transportation of hazardous waste from one country to another. Neither of these international environmental agreements find any specific mention in the ISO written guidelines. Yet, because of the language of the GATT, the ISO standard itself will become a de facto international agreement, though it was not negotiated by any country and had no public input outside of the technical committees responsible for drafting the standards. From a legal standpoint, ISO could become a standard in more ways than one. First, as I mentioned earlier, the GATT agreement has several annexes that are important to the way ISO 14000 series may develop. Attached to the GATT is an agreement on technical barriers to trade, an agreement on sanitary and phytosanitary measures, and an understanding on rules and procedures governing the settlement of disputes. Now, it's interesting that the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement, or the TBT agreement, recognizes the important contribution the international standards and conformity assessment systems can make by improving efficiency of production and facilitating the conduct of international trade. In other words, the TBT agreement urges parties to adopt standards which, under the GATT, are defined as voluntary guidelines approved by a recognized body. Now, that definition could not fit ISO 14000 more precisely. The Annex on Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures also urges parties to adopt regulatory standards to protect human health from contaminants in the food supply. Again, the notion of standards in this context fits the ISO 14000 model. In other words, the very language of GATT, which was admittedly negotiated and adopted by countries in a relatively open and political process, adopts the ISO 14000 proposal even before we've seen how ISO 14000 will work in the practical world. GATT creates a safe harbor from trade challenges for companies that are adopting ISO 14000 as their means of doing business, and thereby even further encourages its spread and adoption throughout the globe. Implicit in the GATT's acceptance of ISO 14000 are issues of concern for countries that may want to adopt more rigorous standards than those contemplated by the environmental management system described in the ISO framework. Under the GATT, adherence with standards set by international bodies, such as ISO, is a safe harbor. But if an individual country wanted to adopt more rigorous technical specifications for its own products, they have to be justified to the new World Trade Organization. That justification would have to illustrate the scientific basis for the more rigorous standard. If the more rigorous standard was successfully challenged by another member of GATT, the regulation or law could be struck down. Let's take a hypothetical example. Suppose one country wanted to encourage superior environmental performance for companies within its borders. It passes a law allowing only those companies who have undertaken extensive environmental self-examinations and made the results public every year, something ISO 14000 does not require, to use a special eco-label to identify that its products are environmentally friendly. Well, this country could face a challenge under the GATT for having created a technical barrier to trade, and that it required more rigorous procedures for products to be sold within its border with the eco-friendly label. Those examples looked at ISO 14000 from the point of view of those who want more environmental performance. In fairness, there are those who think ISO 14000 goes a long way because it does require a company to adopt an environmental management system. There are those who think that even this goes farther than what should be required. For companies who don't want to adopt the ISO 14000 environmental management system, believing it ought not to be necessary as long as they're complying with their own country's rules. ISO represents yet a different challenge. The legal systems of many countries recognize the notion of standard of care, and it's recognized in much of the developed world. Under that notion, it is a defense to argue that everything done in your company is done to the same standard of care as is done in any other company in the same industry. In other words, it's a legal defense to argue that your activities are undertaken just as carefully as those of anybody else. Once ISO 14000 becomes widely accepted, it could well become a standard of care that will be used as a measure to assess how careful your operations are being conducted at any particular facility. If all of the other makers of brooms show their factories are ISO 14000 certified, it will be difficult for the one broom maker whose factory is not to argue that he has been just as careful in protecting the environment and those in it as anyone else. In other words, ISO 14000 may create a de facto standard for the entire industry, even though it begins as a voluntary standard that need only be adopted by those who wish to adopt it. For myself, I've always looked at that proverbial glass of water and seen it half full instead of half empty. I think that ISO 14000 provides an opportunity for the world to get closer to the real goal, which is the recognition that sustainable development is crucial to the survival of our world and everything in it. ISO 14000 can help in that process, but it is no substitute for the environmental laws and regulations that have pushed industry closer and closer to that goal. It is a tool that can be used effectively. It should not be relied on as a means to protect the environment, but it should be embraced as a means for industry to begin to understand how to improve the environmental aspects of its operations. ISO 14000 can be very valuable to the world if it is used in good faith by industry seeking to improve its performance. But one must be careful in the implementation of these standards to ensure that we keep our eyes on the prize.
Thank you, Mr. Opper. Let's continue with the second question and answer session. We are going to go now to a question that we received via fax coming from Colonia Carolla, Córdoba, Argentina, which says, if all organizations were to comply with national and international environmental laws and standards, would ISO 14000 be needed?
The answer is yes. You still need it, because ISO 14000 makes it more uniform so that you can follow it uniformly around the globe. So the management standard will be more useful if you have that type of a guideline.
And we really don't have international laws that mandate organizations adopt a policy for themselves that they will comply with law and that they will always improve their own performance. So ISO 14000 adds something to the world's legal system, and it's very useful.
And now let's receive our first question in our second question and answer session coming from Villahermosa, Tabasco, Mexico, from Instituto Tecnológico de Villahermosa. Good morning. What statistical data do you have from the countries that suffer environmental problems, and how has ISO 14000 been implemented there?
Well, we really don't have very much statistical data at this time because ISO 14000 is so new that it's only been adopted by a handful of companies in the different countries, although I heard one caller suggest that there was perhaps 100 companies. Really don't have the information yet to come to those conclusions.
Another thing I also noticed, like this morning in a conversation I found out, like there was only one company that was first certified in the United States, and that is here in San Diego. But we are wondering whether it is self-certification or it was certified by another agency that claimed to certify the ISO 14000, because officially we don't have any agency right now to certify ISO 14000. because ISO 14000 can be self-certified by the company itself.
Our next participant is coming us from Mexico, from Tampico. Let's hear. Hello. This is the question. What is the response of the oil companies in the implementation of ISO 14000?
The oil companies are especially enthusiastic in ISO 14000. I was there in Toluca about a week ago, and I was talking to the officials from Pemex. And I've never seen so much of enthusiasm of implementing ISO 14000 as I saw in this oil company. And the oil companies in the technologically advanced countries are also now seriously considering of implementing ISO 14000, and probably they have already started towards implementing it.
Let's travel now to Puerto Vallarta, Jalisco. The question comes from Universidad de Guadalajara, Centro Universitario de la Costa. Go ahead. Yes, good morning. What are the advantages that the labeling standards will allow for the final consumer product?
There is quite a lot of advantages. One is you certify that not only the product is safe, but the packaging or even the contents of the product is recyclable and they're environmentally safe. That gives an impetus for people to buy the product, thus increasing your sales market.
Let's go now to Rio de Janeiro. Our next question comes from KTV Comunicaciones Limitada. Go ahead. Good afternoon. Who are the main requirements of ISO 14000 that should be followed once that they have been informed and that should be complied with?
There are quite a few technical committees and major countries are taking part in drafting these principles or the standards themselves or management standards. And like life cycle assessment, we have the United States taking a very active part right now, and it's based purely on the existing RCRA laws. And the labeling is becoming highly controversial because each country wants it to be labeled in their own way. Like if it's a tortilla, you have to label it as tortilla and not as a corn cake. So that does not sound correct. So the labeling systems are going to be adapted as to where the product originates from or how the product is going to be used by which customer. So here the labeling standards have to conform to that particular country, but we do have general guidelines, and that was one of the things that was actually holding up the ISO 14000 implementation procedures.
Well, you know, we also need to address the fact that in adopting ISO 14000, the very first thing that has to happen is that the organization has to adopt a policy